thank you everyone who's logged in to watch us today or is in the process of tuning in. And thank you to the panelists for joining as well. I'd just like to open the webinar with an acknowledgement to the Palawa here in Lutruwita. And as this is a national event across Australia, I would like to pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples Australia-wide, carried by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and the land and sea which we call home is the world's oldest continuing living culture, dating back to over 65,000 years. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples were the first artists, scientists, creators, storytellers, and so much more. So, welcome everyone. It's great to see a lot of people tuning in for today's session. This is actually the first of a few early career ecologist events that the Ecological Society of Australia is running this month and next month. So for those of you that are going to NARM Melbourne in December, there's a few things to get involved with. So we have the ECE Careers Forum and Networking session at 3:30 p.m. on Wednesday the 11th. And at the session, there'll be 9 speakers representing local and state government, natural resource management, NGOs, industry, traditional owners, consultancies, zoos, botanical gardens, and academia. And you'll hear from each of the panelists about their career, which will be followed by a Q&A where you can ask them some questions. And then after the Careers Forum, there's going to be an informal networking session where you can speak to them directly as well as meet the other attendees. So that will be on the Wednesday, but then throughout the whole week, there's actually going to be an ECE mentor booth. Now, I know I find this when I go to conference, it can be quite overwhelming. Lots of people, you want to sort of talk to someone, maybe for a bit of advice, but it's absolutely terrifying and confusing as to how to go about that. So to solve this problem, there's going to be a mentor booth run throughout the entire week. And what you can do, you can sign up for one-on-one sessions of about 10 minutes in length, and then you can directly talk to a mentor, seek guidance, and ask questions. So go to the ESA 2024 website to reserve a spot in that. Very much recommend it. And talking about questions, if you have any questions that you'd like to submit during today's webinar panel for our 3 amazing panelists, please use the Q&A. Ignore the chat function. Don't use that one. Just pop it in the Q&A. And we've got an hour's slot today. So obviously, we're not going to be able to cover everything that we could possibly cover in the entire world about being an early career ecologist, but we'll do our very best. So yes, if you have a question, pop it on in there. So who do we have with us today? Well, I'm Ollie Dove. I'm a climate research officer at the National Environmental Science Programme. I'm a team member on the 1 Million Turtles Citizen Science Project, and I'm also the weekly host and co-manager of the That's What I Call Science radio podcast show. Joining me today, I have Dr. Holly Bradley, who is a research fellow at Curtin University with a range of experience, from studying the behavioural ecology of sloths in Costa Rica to honey possum conservation in Western Australia. We also have Dr. Heather Neely, who is a landscape ecologist with a particular interest in arid zone restoration. She's currently an ARC Early Career Industry Fellow at Federation University, exploring the best ways to restore functional and resilient eucalyptus woodlands. And lastly, we have Dr. Adam Frew, who is a researcher at Western Sydney University, where he studies arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, which I did have to practice saying a few times, and he looks at how they affect plants and what influences their diversity and composition. So thank you all. Thanks to the 3 of you for getting involved and being here today. And I think to kick off our discussion, our roundtable chat, I think there's one big elephant in the room, one big question that a lot of people have probably signed in to find out the answer to. And that is, what is an ECR, early career researcher, or an ECE, early career ecologist, even mean? What is that term? When are you one? How long do you stay one? It's a big question. So do we have any volunteers that would like to kick off with what ECE means for you?
Sure, I can start. I'd just like to firstly apologise. Recovering a bit from a cold, so my voice might be a bit husky today, but I'll try my best. Let me know if you can't hear me properly. But from what I've seen, there is no clear one definition of what is an ECE or ECR, so it's not the easiest one to answer. But from my experience, what I've seen is it's when you're about 5 to 10 years out from postgraduate course or PhD. So it's when you're in that first phase, straight after completing your studies, and you suddenly become a researcher and you're establishing yourself. So it's that phase when you might not have a lot of papers or publications behind you, that you might not have established yourself as an independent researcher yet. You're in that beginning phase. And luckily, a lot of grants or opportunities recognise that. So they distinguish between mid-career researcher and early career researcher to give an understanding that you might not have that background of a lot of experience yet or a lot of publications yet. And there tend to be a few more opportunities, or at least like when you're going for grants, a separation so that you're not competing against someone who might have had 15 years of experience to have worked with people, established a network, published papers. You're, for example, the last grant I went for considered an early career researcher, someone only 5 years out from a PhD. So it kind of makes it a more even playing field. But yeah, I'll hand it over to anyone who wants to add more to that.
I'd just add, I agree, Holly. If you are, looking at specific grants, such as fellowships through the Australian Research Council, they have quite a strict definition of early career researcher, which is your maximum of 5 years post-PhD. And it's important to note that the clock is only ticking once your PhD is conferred, for, in those particular type of grants. And also if you're working less than a full-time equivalent, so if you're working half-time, whatever part-time, that is taken into consideration. So it's not necessarily 5 calendar years, it's the equivalent of 5 years full-time employment. And not only just employment, but it has to be in a research job. If you go and take a job somewhere else in the government or something and you're not doing any research, that doesn't add to your 5 years, if that makes sense. And plus, if you have caring responsibilities or, different types of leave, that can all be sort of accounted for. So I'm probably on the elder side of an early career researcher. In fact, I think I might be just sort of about to exit that, that category. But technically I'm 7 years post-PhD, but I've had a lot of career interruptions that have been included in that.
Yeah, I don't know if I have much to add to that. Although now I think maybe, I'm probably about the same stage as you, Heather, I suspect, time-wise. And I feel like I'm kind of in that stage of life when when I don't know if I can call myself early career anymore, but I don't really feel like I'm mid-career, and maybe it's like imposter syndrome. I don't know. I feel like maybe I'm just going to be eternally comfortable calling myself early career until maybe I'm a emeritus professor or something. But it is a hard one, because even with those strict deadlines, like those strict timelines like the ARC give, sometimes you'll see, I don't know these people's individual situations, but you'll see, like associate professors getting DECRAs or and so obviously their situation might be different, such that yes, they obviously do qualify within that 5-year period, but it makes you, and it tries to level that playing field, but sometimes you wonder how much does it level the playing field sometimes, because that 5 years, it can depend a lot on opportunities and other things as well. Yeah, it's a bit of a hard one. I've also seen other ones where they maybe define it as 3 years, and then like Holly was saying, like up to 10 years even. Yes, but this is a good question to start off with, I think, because it's something I'm constantly grappling with. Is where am I in my career timeline?
And it's always great to tell your relatives that you're an early career ecologist when you're 40 years old, and they're thinking, haven't you been working for the past 20 years and you're an early career? So, it's in one way it's comfortable to sit in early career because it does afford you a little bit more sort of leeway, but yeah, it's interesting how academia classify these things.
And then that was sort of looking at the concept of ECE in terms of the grants and the very strict way of thinking about it. But in terms of thinking of ECE and ECR as a community, so for example, anyone out there, you can sign up to get involved in the ESE working group, or there's also an ESE newsletter. So there's more to being an ECE than just applying for grants. Do you have to have done a PhD to be considered within that group? What if you've only done an honours, or sorry, not only, but done an honours and a master's, you're still thinking about whether PhD is for you? Would you consider they're still within our community? Would anyone like to?
Yeah, I would think that ECE should really, I mean, what's the definition? Actually, yeah, I would think it should be inclusive of from the ground up. So anyone who's even still doing their undergraduate, right, in say ecology or related subdiscipline within that, then I suppose they're not necessarily working per se in like paid employment as part of that degree, but they're still very early in their career if they then choose to then have a career in ecology. So I think it's useful to sort of include those people as well. I
think so as well, particularly, outside of the specific definitions with grants, for example, going to conferences, and there's often early career events put on. I've been going to those since, I was still studying and doing an honours, because it's really about the community and meeting other people who are still learning, who are still figuring it out at the beginning of their career, and just meeting other people in the same boat and learning from each other and getting to start to form your network. So when you start going to more conferences, you can keep meeting these people and form that community. That's something I've really enjoyed about conferences.
And Heather, I might pass this one over to you, but we've had a question in the Q&A. Thank you for using it. But also, this has been focusing on research, but ECE can cover those people in industry as well. So how do you see, Heather, how do you see the ECE community on a wider, moving away from academia and including people in other career paths as well?
I think the more people we can include under that umbrella, the better. I think we have to get away from thinking that academia is is a box and industry is a box. What I'm seeing more and more is that it's a flow between the two. I'm a good example of that. I've worked in industry immediately after my honours for about 10 years, and then went back and did a PhD, and so have been sort of straddling the industry academic world my whole career. So I think if there are industry ecologists who are at the beginning of their career and they want to be involved in these kind of communities, that I think that's fantastic, because you don't have to choose a lane and stay there. You can change lanes as many times as you want. I think if you are an early career ecologist who is very focused on research, it is very beneficial for you to have a network of early career ecologists that are in industry, to start forming those connections, early on, and be able to sort of understand the industry side of things, even if you're not actually working in industry.
And to follow on from that. And I might stick with you, Heather, for this next question. Sorry to
Sure.
double
That's
up. But a lot of people, when they go through undergrad, master's, PhD, they're sort of trying to make that decision about whether, because it seems like those two paths, you stay in academia or you don't. Were there any skills that you found particularly useful throughout your studies or your tertiary education that helped set you up for going between the both of them?
Look, to be honest, I don't think I ever sort of intentionally did anything when I was in my 20s. But yeah, I certainly would, and this is what I've heard from lots of other people, that feeling of pressure, like you have to choose to stay in academia, and if you leave academia, like you can never go back, kind of thing. I completely disagree with that. That hasn't been experienced whatsoever. So yeah, I didn't sort of intentionally do it, but once I'd finished my honours, I was sick of uni and I wanted to work. I wanted to earn money. I wanted to experience other things in life. I wanted to move, there was a bunch of things. But what I would say is any experience I've had in academia in industry has only helped me in academia. Academia is not just about sort of thinking and coming up with brilliant ideas. There's a lot of project management, budget management, people management, communication skills, being able to translate your research into real life, things that are applicable in the real world. So a lot of those skills are what you learn in industry. And if you can have those skills and then you bring them to your academic world, that's only a good thing in my experience. So yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about feeling like you have to choose a path and then that's your path forever. You can switch between the two as you wish.
I might pass on over to Adam. How did you find following the path and the decisions that you made along the way?
Looking back, I wonder how much I really decided a lot of things rather than tried to look for something that I was interested in, and it just so happened that the topic or the kind of ecological systems or questions that I like to ask or work within ended up being within research. Because like from my PhD, for example, so I initially wasn't even planning to do a PhD. I did my undergrad and then I was thinking of then maybe doing like environmental law or something. And then it just so happened that there was a PhD opportunity and the topic was really interesting. I thought, well, this would be fun. And then it kind of went from there, I suppose. And I ended up, so at that stage, I didn't see myself as like going into academia or research per se. I was trying to think of other ways to sort of apply my interest in the environment and interactions between organisms. But yeah, so there wasn't really like that was, I suppose, a decision that I made. I decided to go for the PhD, and yeah, and then during my PhD as well, after the first year of my PhD, I actually quit, and then and then I worked at the Apple Store for a year, and then came back. And because of how I had handled that terribly, I basically had to reapply for a new PhD. And I think for me that was just I maybe went too quickly into the PhD without maybe getting the kind of skills that we were just sort of mentioning there, like project management. I mean, still, obviously, you're in your PhD, it's still very early days, right? But I hadn't really acquired much of that just from my undergrad and just from my honors. So to then dive in straight into the PhD at the time, although I suppose it's harder to do now, but yeah. So, and anyway, so it all worked out well in the end. I think I benefited a lot from that break. It was definitely not working in ecology, working at the Apple Store, but I think that gave me some some experience in the real world, so-called, which gave me some perspective, I suppose. And then after that, I was looking for postdocs and other things at the time, because at that point I kind of knew what I kind of was hoping I could do, and whether I was able to do it or not was another question. But I'll stop there before I give you my entire life history.
No, I feel like it would be great to listen to it though. I actually have a follow-up question for that, if that's okay, because I think for a lot of the attendees here, it probably is really awesome to hear of someone dropping out and coming back and then continuing on as a successful researcher, because we can have this massive fear of failure in what we do. It takes a lot of bravery to then come back into the system and take 2 for a PhD. Was there any support that you were provided or that you looked for and acquired yourself that helped you to go back in and start again?
I think I had kept in touch somewhat with people at Western Sydney. I'm trying to remember exactly how much, but it basically came from that. I had spent time away from it entirely, and it was almost like a breath of fresh air or different air, but it was more that there was a point where I was like, actually, that I do want to do a PhD, like I do want to go and do research. And so then I just reached out to HIE, the institute that I'm in at Western Sydney. And I would say that my supervisors were really supportive of that, actually, especially considering how I had left in a drop mic run sort of fashion. And then they also helped me find, because I had dropped out, I then had to sort of look for ways to support that. So I had to look for funding. And so my supervisors helped me with that, pointing me in the right direction. And I ended up looking for industry funding for the scholarship so that I was able to do it. And so that was super important. Like, there's no doubt that had I inquired, because I did inquire tentatively, I wasn't like, oh yes, they're just gonna, throw another scholarship at me and I'm just gonna be welcomed back like nothing had like I hadn't quit. But I do know that it was a difficult decision higher up, I think, to let me come back. But personally, from my experience, I don't think I would have. I think I benefited so much from having that break that it was super beneficial for me to then be able to handle the rest of the PhD and continue on.
Awesome.
Just adding to that, I also took a break between my honours and my PhD, and so it's something I do recommend if people are thinking about it or are scared to do it. I did it as well, and I found it super useful to go and work for a year and then come back to academia, because 8 years is a long time to study straight. It can be a good thing to go and do something different, gain some experience elsewhere. That's when I went and worked in Costa Rica, and then I came back to Australia and started the PhD.
Well, that's not as cool as the Apple Store.
Awesome. Absolutely agree with both of you there. I did 2 years between my bachelor's and master's and 1 year between master's and PhD. And I have friends that went the whole way through without a break and they managed it, but I have no idea how. I think I would have. Yeah, I definitely needed to go out and back in. But Holly, thinking of those here that are still studying or still working on PhDs, if they're kind of overwhelmed with the choices or lack of choices after their studies, would you have any advice that you would give them or want to give to your past self when you were in that situation?
Yeah, I'm not sure if there is one piece of good, useful advice. I know that in ecology, the world changes a lot, even within the span of 5 years. So you can't my advice would be to be flexible. You might have a desired plan ahead, but it would be good to be flexible to, if it doesn't work out, have plans B and C. For example, when I finished my honours, it was at a downturn time and there were just no jobs in ecology or environment. It was really hard to get a job at that time, whereas finishing my PhD, it's at a time where there's a lot of available jobs, particularly in consulting, and it's quite a good time at the moment to find a job in the environment. So some things like that can be pretty hard to predict. So it's good if you might have an intended idea, but also be open. So for example, that's why I ended up going to Costa Rica, because it was just really hard to find a job in Australia. So I was open after my honours and just took the opportunity, went and worked away for a year and then came back, and it was a bit of a better environment. It can also help you make decisions. I wasn't thinking of doing a PhD either, but it was at another time where it was not so many jobs available. So it did kind of push me in that direction of, well, I could do paid research in this interesting area, and I have a job for 3-4 years. So that kind of led me in that direction, which is not necessarily where I saw myself. But also keeping open to opportunities. So I continued volunteering even when I was doing my PhD. I volunteered with other PhDs, so you can kind of broaden your skills, but also I continued with DBCA. I continued volunteering, so I maintained my networks so that when I was coming to the end of my PhD, that I had a network there of people to talk to and ask advice from. And when I was looking for jobs, I had a network that was broader than just the few academics I was working with. And for people, it might not help if you've already started a PhD, but if you're thinking of starting a PhD, one thing that I hadn't thought of, which I would have liked as advice, is if you can find a research group. I found that the community there was a lot more supportive than when I did my honours. I came up with the idea myself and got support from academics, which was great, but I was a lone researcher and it could get quite lonely. Whereas I was fortunate for my PhD to join a research group, and you go through with other PhDs, which is a great way to go through 4 years, not on your own, but it also means that you're surrounded with other academics and other researchers. So there's people there for support to help give you advice when you're coming to the end of your PhD as well, to help you. If you do want to stay in academia, you've got a research group there that you can go to, would be some of my advice.
Yeah, brilliant. And that's also a great chance as well to plug the networking session at ESA 2024 for anyone going to the conference to meet different people and start forming those connections. So a lot of when we discuss research and careers and the paths that we follow, it sort of depends on the funding available, and that can sort of limit us or also open up opportunities. So I'll pass this one back to Heather to start us off. We've mentioned things like DECRA and ARC and all these things, which I'm aware of what they are now, but at the start of my PhD, people would say things like that, and I would have no idea what they were talking about. So what is funding like when you're in the early stages of your career, and just what is that whole sort of black hole of the funding world like once you're out of the stipend and you're out of the uni? What do you do?
Yeah. Well, I'm definitely not an expert on every type of funding available, so I'll just talk from my own experience. But yeah, this won't be an exhaustive list. But so I guess you can get a job as a postdoc. So quite often your supervisor or maybe other more senior academics that you've met during your PhD or worked with may well have postdoctoral opportunities. And sometimes these are, you know, short-term kind of contracts. They might just have a year's worth of salary or something to pay someone to complete a specific, you know, piece of research or analyze something or write up some papers or whatever. So in my experience, a lot of people I know did little sort of strung together postdocs, you know, through time. But a lot of them that were doing that kind of thing, they were sort of using that to fund themselves through while they applied for the research funding that they wanted. So yeah, so I guess the big major research funding for early career people in Australia is through the Australian Research Council. It's either a DECRA, which is part of the Discovery program, or more recently, they've opened up as part of the linkage program, the industry fellowship, and that's what I'm on. So depending on how linked your research is to industry, you know, might determine which way you go for that. But generally, that gives you 3 years of salary plus project costs, and you are proposing a project yourself that you've come up with. Usually, not always, but usually it's sort of, you know, follows on from your PhD research, or you've got to, I guess, tell the selection committee that you are the right person to be doing that particular piece of research. So, you know, it's based on your record of what you've already done. And that will give you, 3 years of full-time salary. With the one that I'm on, the industry fellowship, that was certainly very much about the industry connections that you had and making sure that the research that you were doing is actually research that industry partners want to help them solve problems that they're facing themselves. So, yeah, does that answer your question? I think you guys chime in with other stuff, but in terms of like getting your salary funded, as far as I know, that the DECRA or the industry fellowship are sort of the two major avenues to pursue your own research in Australia.
Yeah, that's, I would say that for me, there's also sometimes like I suppose maybe more ephemeral or regular fellowships available. So I don't know if they still have them, but Macquarie University, for example, have fellowships. I think you have to be 3 years or less post PhD, and it's a similar process where you might have an idea of a project. It's more than likely continuing on or building on what you've done already in your PhD or before. And then that's sort of funded by the university. I had one of those, not at Macquarie, but at Charles Sturt Uni in Wagga Wagga. And that was, but they only had it once and then never did it again. So, but it was the same thing where you proposed your project and they kind of assessed you and the project. And that way you could sort of pursue your own questions. And then, I suppose, like Heather said, you've got your sort of more traditional postdocs that become available. There might also be like, I suppose you might call them like technical positions, but sometimes, they might have slightly different requirements, but it's still something that you could do post PhD. In terms of academia, I suppose those are the main ones for getting a salary anyway.
The extra advice I'd give with that, which I found useful, is that things like the industry fellowship, you only get 2 chances at. So it can be a good idea to not go for it straight away after your PhD. It was some good advice I was given, is to give yourself a bit of time to, you might not get all of your publications done with your PhD, so give yourself some time to get some more publications under your belt, apply for some of the smaller seed grants to maybe do a short-term project which can prove your concept, or prove that you've got a network with industry, that you've got a relationship established. Take a bit more time to think about the project you want to do, and for example, go through co-design if that's something you're interested, like with an industry fellowship. And it's okay to go out, for example, and work a bit in industry, or take a research assistant position, which might not be where you want to be yet, but it can give you some time to put together the best proposal possible, because you only get a few chances. And for example, some of them is like a 14% chance of success. So you want to give yourself that best chance.
And that's exactly what I did, Holly. I worked for the industry partner. So straight out of my PhD, I went and worked for in industry for the industry partner, who I was, well, I didn't know at the time, but I guess I was grooming them to be my industry partner in my application. So yeah, at the time I was just taking a job, but yeah, what it ended up with was that relationship that I could then use as to get more research funding.
We've had a question in the Q&A about wanting to explore further education, be it master's or PhD, but being concerned about being locked in a research stream. Can you move fields if your interests change? So given that you mentioned, Heather, those 3-year contracts, can you move fields if your interests change?
I've certainly moved fields. So even within research, not like, I guess not massively moved fields, but moved within ecology, sort of moved around a little bit. So I think it's probably quite possible. I mean, I guess if you wanted to move from, I don't know, I can't think of a good example, but say you wanted to move into something really specific, like, I don't know, genetics or something that needed specific skills that you didn't have. I don't know how easy it is to move across those kind of barriers, but I don't know. I think if you want to do it, you can find a way. You know, you get additional training that you might need. Maybe you need to go volunteer with people for a while and just sort of, you know, put in a bit of legwork. But I would certainly not let that stop me if I wanted to change research fields.
I've got an answer for that too, because I've had people ask me the question, why would you do a PhD? Like you put yourself into this niche box and that's the direction you're going. And I think that it all depends on opportunities available, but you can set up your research in a way where that's not the case. So for my PhD, I worked on a species of endangered lizard where we basically knew nothing about it. So I was looking at basic biology of this species and its ecology, and I used lots of different novel technologies like LiDAR and plasticine models, camera traps. I used a whole range of techniques to answer this ecological question that had applications for industry and how they select translocation sites and how they complete their rehab. So whilst it was one project, there were lots of different technologies I used. For example, genetics was a component. So it was basically an opportunity to do training in a whole lot of different techniques, which set me up. If I wanted to take any of those directions in the future, I could say, well, I have experience with that. Could also learned a lot about a specific reptile and threatened species. So if I wanted to go in that direction, I could, but it was also looking at ecology. So that's also quite a broad topic, which can then flow into a whole lot of different things. Because my next job was looking at conservation of threatened bats, and bats are quite different, but because I had experience with threatened species and conservation and management, my PhD was quite broad. I saw it as an opportunity to open lots of doors rather than restrict me in a particular lane as such. And you also you don't know what techniques or experiences might open opportunities in the future. So it doesn't hurt to do a master's like the question had, and if there's you apply different techniques or answer questions, it might open the door to opportunities you hadn't thought about before. So for example, when I did work experience in high school, I worked with DBCA and did radio tracking of numbats, which was just some fun experience that I enjoyed doing, but little did I know years later when I applied for the sloth biology position, having experience with radio tracking is what set me apart from the rest of the global applicants, which I didn't know when I included in my resume, but sometimes doing something quite specific can have applications later that you didn't know, and the job interviewers can see favorably.
Yeah, I love numbats. That sounds awesome.
Yeah, it was fun.
Completely agree there with the fact that you're not necessarily locked in. I did something very specific and niche in seabird ecology and their diving behavior for my PhD, but I now work in climate adaptation and freshwater turtles. And those two positions came about because of the science communication volunteering I did alongside the PhD, not actually because of the PhD itself. So if there are chances or opportunities, as you mentioned, Holly, earlier, helping with other projects along the way, I would very much recommend it as well, because as you said, something that you don't realize is going to be useful in the future can actually loop back round. So the next question that I'm going to let anyone who wants to pop their hand up to answer it, but there's a concept in specifically, it's often more used in academia, but maybe comes across in industry as well, is the concept of publish or perish. So Holly, you mentioned getting some more papers post-PhD before applying for an industry fellowship. How do any of you or each of you, how did you find the concept? Have you found that it's true, or have you found that actually it's a myth and a bit of a scaremongering phrase? Any takers?
No one wants to say anything. I think, I suppose it depends what your goal is, right? But unfortunately or fortunately, people will often look at your publications as the evidence of what research you've done in academia, and maybe depending what industry you're working in, they might look at it as like, they might value it to an extent. But certainly, like for looking for postdocs or other research positions, publications is kind of what you look at. Publish or perish seems a little bit end of the world type of phrasing, but I suppose the point is it is important to have publications. But I think more and more as well, it's important to have some publications, but it's not just about having as many as possible. There is more and more sort of leaning towards, as a lot of us here probably know, like other forms of communicating your research. So it's not just that you got it published in so-and-so journal, but also like, well, how else did you communicate what you're doing? Who else did you engage with? Whether it's media or communities or schools or anything, right? So I think more and more universities and research institutions do value that. They see that as having impact as well. I do think it seems to be ridiculous these days, and everyone says this, how there might be an expectation, the expectation of publication. I remember when I was just finishing my PhD and someone gave a talk about when they did their PhD, and it was like, oh, I finished my PhD, and after that I had one publication, and that was enough for me to get a permanent position, and that was it. Whereas it's quite different now, so the expectations are different. So yeah, it's definitely something that is, I guess it kind of sucks in a lot of ways, but that's how people sort of measure what you've done as like evidence, because you could say in your application for a postdoc, for example, oh yes, I've done this, that, and the next thing, and they might be it just sort of supports it to say, oh yeah, and they've published it. And so the people who are assessing the applications can see, oh yeah, there's the publication, and I can see that's what they've done. And so it's like evidence of the research that you've done. I don't know if that's a depressing answer or not.
I agree with Adam. I think, yeah, publish or perish is a very inflammatory sort of phrase, I think. But I mean, when doing science, your science isn't completed until you've communicated it, I guess, or until you've published your results. And our system is that we have, peer-reviewed journals. And I guess it's not so much evidence that you've done something, but it is evidence that you've done something, but it's also evidence that you've done something that was robust scientifically and was able to be published in a peer-reviewed journal. So it does show that you have done science, good science, and you've kind of done your job. And I think the way I try and reframe it a little bit is that, if I'm on a publicly funded PhD stipend, I guess it's my responsibility to publish my work, So even though I won't get into the whole journals and access. Yeah, anyway, we won't worry about that. But I see it as a responsibility that if I do something, it's not finished, and it never happened unless I publish something from it. That's sort of the way I've tried to look at it. And I think more and more with PhDs, there is a push to make each of your chapters a standalone publication. So that does help you, if you're able to do that, that does help you at the end of your PhD to not just have written a huge thesis that you then have to try and convert into publications, but you already have maybe, 3 or 4 or 5 sort of publications, whether or not they're actually published, but they're sort of, ready to go through the pipeline. So yeah, and I totally agree with what Adam's saying, is that people are not just looking at your journal publication record, but your ability to communicate your results. So you might produce a report for an industry partner. You might do, stuff publicly on, The Conversation or on radio or all that kind of stuff. I think there's much more well-rounded understanding of what it means to communicate your science these days. But yeah, unfortunately, you still do need to get those publications.
And I'll just add to that. It's a balance that I'm not sure that I have got exactly right yet, because unfortunately in academia, the currency is publications in understanding your background and that you have experience and that you can publish your results. And in something like a grant application, if you're against people all across Australia, it's one easy way to compare you against other people is how many publications have you got behind you. But I think there's more opportunities, like with the industry fellowship, understanding that there's links with industry. That, for example, I've just applied for an industry fellowship, so that's why it's on my brain. But there's opportunity to explain if you don't have such a high output, to explain why. And so I've got a lot of background with taking time with co-design, so working with industry, with traditional custodians to design research and develop outputs which aren't necessarily going to be in the highest impact journals, because they're specific to Australia, specific to mine rehabilitation, for example. So the outputs are impactful guidelines, for example, but maybe not necessarily in a high impact scientific journal. So there was opportunity there to explain that. And I think there is a move towards, outputs. I'm recognizing outputs that aren't just scientific articles. So for example, the ESA supported me after my PhD in producing a picture book that was co-written with a traditional elder. So it was in dual language. It was a culturally significant skink that I worked on for my PhD. So we told the story of its ecology and its cultural significance together. And we had a traditional artist also illustrate the picture book, and we're getting that published. And that was supported. We got funding to help us go through that journey, which is a very non-traditional output of a PhD. But I think there is a move towards understanding that it's not just publications, but again, it does depend where you want to move. Strictly academia, I think we're moving in the right direction, but publication rate is probably still quite significant, whereas going towards an industry fellowship or an industry funded research position or research position within industry, I think there's more scope to have an understanding that it can be research quality or diversity or impact rather than just the quantity of your output.
Absolutely. And as you've been progressing through your careers, all three of you have been making these accomplishments and in just doing incredible research. But along the way, you've sort of risen up the career rank, and you'll be taking mentees or students under your own wing, and you'll be transitioning from being someone looking out into your career to being someone helping others at the start of their career. I'll open this up to anyone who wants to answer, but how have you juggled the transition between going from a student to a supervisor? Was it difficult, or was it something that sort of naturally comes along? Because I know there's not always a lot of teaching in becoming a supervisor. So what was that process like for you? Are there anyone want to, any supervisors?
My experience was I started supervising honours students first, and that was quite a bit more, you know, manageable. You kind of learn the ropes a little bit with that, and then moving on to, you know, the PhD supervision. I've got 2 students that I supervise as a co-supervisor as well. So you don't necessarily have to go all or nothing. Like, you can sort of ease into the supervisor role by doing honours supervision, co-supervising PhD. So you get to kind of observe a more experienced supervisor. From your own supervisor, you might have a list of what not to do or things that you hope to do differently, so that I think what not to do is as good as, you know, what to do sometimes. So yeah, so I think you can ease into the role. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, I think I did the same. I think as I took on honours students first, but actually something that I always think was really, well, I remember as after my PhD, I didn't actually co-supervise a student for a while, and I think it kind of did hold me back, because even when it came to like applying for the DECRA, it was something even the assessors were, because some of the comments were like, oh, you know, he'll need particular support with the supervising because he hasn't supervised. But it's kind of a hard one, because like you just finished your PhD and then they ask, well, how many PhDs have you supervised to completion? It's like, well, timeline wise, that's not actually going to be possible, even if I like supervise a PhD as soon as I finish. So I think that's where sometimes more senior individuals who maybe can give someone earlier in their career the opportunity to co-supervise is actually really important, because then they start having that track record and that experience to then build up more progressively to then taking on their own students eventually. So that's something that I would hope to encourage. But also, I would say I'm still learning how to supervise. And one thing I have learned is that every student is very different. So I thought, oh, you know, I'm going to be like super duper nice and super duper accessible and so helpful, without realizing that's not sustainable, you know, just to like succumb to every question and whim of a student. And so it is about finding that balance to be supportive, but in the most efficient way. Like, these are all things some students want more contact, some don't need it so much. And yeah, a lot of it. So I would say I'm definitely still learning and still transitioning. I don't know if I'll ever stop, really.
And that's something where the research group, again, can become useful, because even if it's not a formal supervisor position, if you're all working in a team in a close environment together and you're there as a researcher who's been there for quite a while, naturally, some of the new students who come on might come to you for advice and questions, and it becomes quite an easy transition to becoming more of that mentor role, even if it's not official, and might progress towards becoming officially supervisor or co-supervisors.
Absolutely. Well, unfortunately, we are coming to the top of the hour. We're coming to midday, or at least here in Hobart. So we'll wrap up there, because I'm sure there's quite a few people that might have midday meetings that they have to meet, and everyone's on a schedule, with a very busy schedule. But thank you to everyone who popped a question in the Q&A. We didn't have time to go over everything, but we'll try and get some responses out afterwards and sent out to you, hopefully. So watch out for them, especially some of the more specific ones. And I know you're all sort of in the ether behind computer screens, but maybe just a little round of applause wherever you are for our 3 amazing panelists. So thank you to Dr. Heather Neely, thank you to Dr. Adam Frew, and thank you to Dr. Holly Bradley. And very lastly from me is, remember, if you are going to NARM in December, check out the ECE Careers Forum, the networking session, and the mentor booth, because a lot that was discussed here was about forming connections as well, and how helpful they can be. So hopefully this will be a nice introduction, and you'll feel very eager to go and meet people over there in Melbourne. So from myself, from ESA, and from our 3 panelists, thank you all for joining today, and hope you have a wonderful week, and hope to see you next month. So thank you.